The next morning, the sun was beating down on the barndominium with a vengeance, the kind of heat that was hotter than a blister bug in a pepper patch. The barndominium, an odd mix of barn and house, stood tall and plumb proud in the middle of Cooter community, a place where folks knew you by your granddaddy, and if the creek rose, you were stuck at home. This particular barndominium was the fella's pride and joy, but it was clear that his joy was getting a little frayed around the edges. Bronkey and Pig, having slept off the previous day's excitement, were back out in the pasture. Pig had settled into his wallow, a puddle of mud that had the cool, soothing consistency of a thick milkshake. He was content, a state of being that was happy as a pig in slop. Bronkey, on the other hand, was standing near the fence, watching the fella with a silent, contemplative air. The fella was still staring at the new gopher mound, which had overnight become 2 new gopher mounds. The gopher, it seemed, was working harder than a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. The fella looked from the mounds to the crater left by the firecracker. His face was all twisted up, looking like he'd rode hard and put up wet. He was stuck in a state of pure, unadulterated frustration, a state the fella over at the feed store would have just called piddling. Bronkey let out a long sigh that sounded an awful lot like a rusty gate swinging open. Pig didn't even stir. He was beyond such things. The fella went back into his shed, and a minute later he came out with a bucket of what looked like concrete. Bronkey's ears swiveled. Concrete? This was a new tactic. The fella, with a look of pure focus on his face, began to pour the concrete into the gopher's new hole. He worked fast, a man on a mission. He filled the first hole, then the second, and then, satisfied, he stood back with a look of pure triumph. "Now that dog won't hunt," he said, puffing out his chest. Bronkey watched the concrete settle and harden. It was a smooth, gray monument to the fella's folly. He was trying to win a war of attrition with a creature that lived to dig, and it wasn't an even match. Bronkey had heard the fellow on the porch talking to his wife the night before, complaining about his stupid problems. It reminded Bronkey of what he had heard a feller on the radio say. Don't argue with an idiot. The fella was getting into a plumb ridiculous argument with a gopher, and you just knew it was a battle he couldn't win. The fella's energy was getting drained like a phone battery, and the gopher was the useless app. Sure enough, the next morning brought with it a sight that made the fella's jaw go slack. A new gopher mound had sprouted, not just one, but a whole line of them running from the barndominium's foundation all the way out to the tree line yonder. It looked like the gopher had had a bunch of family over for a digging party. It was a sight to behold, uglier than homemade sin, and it caused a conniption fit of the highest order. The fella screamed, a long, drawn-out cry of despair that made a flock of birds scatter. He looked at the endless line of mounds, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He tried to defeat the gopher by force, by logic, by sheer will, and it failed at every turn. The gopher, which was, it must be said, about as smart as the sense God gave a goose, had simply done what it did best. It had been fed by the fella's attention, and it had thrived. The fella walked over to the fence and leaned against it, his head in his hands. He was plumb tuckered out, a man defeated. Bronkey, for his part, slowly made his way to the fence as well. He stood there for a long moment, not saying a word, just standing and being a silent, steady presence. Pig from his wallow offered a single, sympathetic grunt. The fella looked up at Bronkey, his eyes a little watery. "Bronkey," he said, his voice a low, defeated rasp, that gopher is a genius. He's smarter than me." Bronkey looked at him. He didn't say anything, of course, because he was a donkey. But if he could have, he had pointed a hoof at the fresh line of gopher mounds and then back at the feller. The feller had let the gopher live rent-free in his head. He had given it all his energy and focus, and it had paid him back in kind. He'd been so busy trying to poke the bear that he'd turned his own life into a zoo. He hadn't charged them boundaries, and now the debt was due. Bronkey gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He looked at the endless line of mounds, a trail of destruction that had consumed the fella's summer. It was a good lesson, if only the fella could have been smart enough to learn it. You can't win a battle when you're trying to reason with a creature that only knows how to dig. You just had to let the fool be a fool and go on about your business. He knew in his donkey wisdom that the fella needed to learn when to retreat, where to allocate his energy, and that not every conflict warrants personal investment. He turned and slowly began to walk back towards his favorite spot in the pasture, the spot with the best view of the morning sun. Pig, from his wallow, offered a single sympathetic grunt. The fellow was still standing there, staring at the mounds, a man who had been outsmarted by a rodent. The dust was still settling on his last defeat, but you could almost feel the new one coming.